I'm pretty convinced that if he had been sandwiched in that ice for even another 20 minutes or half hour, like it would have been reaching really critical situation with the hypothermia.
Welcome to the Sharp End Podcast YouTube channel. I'm Ashley, the creator and hostess of the show. This podcast aims at minimizing future outdoor accidents by way of storytelling. Real people sharing real stories. Why don't you gentlemen introduce yourselves? Sam, go ahead and go first.
All right, I'm Sam Lien. I'm 40 years old, live just north of Seattle, and have been climbing and skiing around the Cascades for about 14 years now. And I work as a plastic surgeon at a hospital just north of Seattle.
Nice to meet you. And Alan, what about you?
My name's Alan Taylor. I live in South Seattle. Been skiing with Sam for many, many years now, and originally from New Hampshire, and started skiing in New Hampshire and Vermont, and moved out here about 12 years ago, and I've just been skiing as much stuff as I possibly can since then. And work as an arborist, but obviously skiing has always been the priority.
Skiing's number one. Trees are later. Skiing is first.
We have
Cool. Welcome to
stopped
the show,
on many a
guys.
ski tour to admire trees.
Oh yeah, admire them, get whacked in the
admire
face
trees.
by them. Trees can do so many amazing things.
Oh, that's funny. I've done a lot of bushwhacking in my day too. Fun. Well, what are we talking about today then?
Had a very interesting day up on Mount Baker last spring. It was towards the end of May, though. At least for conditions, it certainly felt more like the end of June. We had a really hot spring, and had a pretty interesting situation where we ended up hollowing this fellow out of a crevasse from another party. So it was,
So Mount Baker is in Washington.
it is. It's one of our glaciated volcanic peaks, and it's a particularly snowy and glaciated one, but not quite as massive as Mount Rainier, which is the big mountain that a lot of people probably know. It's sort of the typical mountain that people climb to get ready for Mount Rainier. So it's like kind of like one step down from that, but still lots of glaciers, lots of snow.
Okay. And what day was this? You said it was in May?
I think it's like the 29th of May. So just getting right on towards the end. And yeah, Sam, do you want to just go through like the plan we had for the day?
Sure. So we arrived at the trailhead pretty early in the day. Our original goal was to climb up the south side of Baker and then ski off the east side and then loop counterclockwise around to the North Ridge and climb back up that to the summit plateau and then ski back down the south side. That ended up being it was a big day. Yeah, ended up being a bigger day than I had anticipated. So we got as far as tagging the summit and skiing a ways down the east side, but then just thinking about the open crevasses with it being a relatively warm spring and the amount of glaciers we still had to traverse just to get to the North Ridge, and then climbing back up and then skiing back down the south side pretty late in the day, we decided to pull the plug. I was very happy to not circumnavigate the mountain and then climb a technical ice ridge. So we ended up skiing back up.
Sam, you can make it sound like this really good, solid risk management decision we made. I feel like my memory is that I didn't want to get home too late on a Sunday night. And if it was a Saturday night, there's a very good chance we would have kept going and just slept in the car.
Yeah, we had our reasons, suffice it to say.
We had headlamps. We had reasons and headlamps.
Yeah.
Sorry, continue.
So we came back up the east face, tagged the summit again, and then came back down the south side. And at this point, actually, most parties had left the summit plateau and were skiing down. There was only one other party that was skiing down around the same time we were coming down. So even then oh shoot, Alan, we probably left the summit at like 3 o'clock or so, maybe 2:30.
At least, maybe pushing later. 4 or something like that. It was getting kind of late, and it'd been a really busy day on the mountain. You know, I bet probably just the route we were on probably saw 30 or 40 people at least.
Wow.
Probably more. It's a really popular route. And
Yeah, I guess
and
so.
Mount Baker is just a really popular mountain, so popular route on a popular mountain.
Right.
But it was definitely getting on towards mushy snow o'clock, and that certainly that time of day when the bridges start getting a bit soft. But yeah, so I think
The snow bridges.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So it's that classic thing where folks like to wake up early, and ideally the snow is a bit more hard and frozen first thing in the morning. And the classic mountaineering thing is you wake up at like 11 and try to get off the mountain before things get too soft and mushy. A lot of those folks are shooting for even being off the mountain by early or mid morning. And at least in our experience, skis give you a bit more leeway. Just your ability to move around and also have your weight be distributed seems to make a big difference there. But as I'm sure this story will relate, skis are not a perfect solution to the crevasse problem. Um, but yeah, anyway, so we dropped off the top, and I was actually skiing out ahead a little bit, and was just sort of along with this other group of three guys that were just ahead of us, and Sam was just a little ways behind, and came up over a roll. So we were relatively high on the Squawk Glacier, which you go to the trailhead, walk some trail for a while, and then you get popped right out on the base of this glacier, and you head from the toe right up the mountain. And at a certain point, you have to traverse around to a different climb to the summit. But it's just the thing that's like straight up out of the woods. And there's a couple of convexities a little bit higher on it. And I mean, granted, you start on this glacier and you're at the total toe of it, or just little snowfields and that sort of thing, and then it builds as you go up. But we were relatively high on the glacier, not too far below where we make this traverse around to this feature called the Roman Wall, and just sort of popped over a roll, and there are these two folks that were waving at us. I think they were partners of the fellow who ended up being in the crevasse. We're going to call him Ben, even though that's not his name. I just wasn't sure if he wanted to be associated with this. So we'll just give him a pseudonym for the sake of this one. But just, his two female partners were waving at us. And, at first I thought they were just being kind and being like, watch out for that hole. But then they're yelling, there's somebody in the hole. And that was certainly not a good thing to hear. But the good news is, I mean, we were there, we had lots of gear, and just sort of started diving into what's it going to take to get this all figured out. And luckily, he was actually able to communicate out of the hole. He wasn't super deep down in there. And I estimated after, we did some rigging a little later on that is about 35 feet down. This is absolutely a glacier, but we're not talking about like an Alaska glacier or some of the
It has
glaciers.
tons of crevasses that you
Yeah,
can see
yeah,
and avoid.
yeah. And this
Yeah.
is like, in this fellow's defense, this is a really popular area. People go there. I've like been drinking beers on this glacier in a cutoff t-shirt. It's the sort of place where I think there's a real feeling of safety in numbers because there's so many people there. And it doesn't feel like a big scary part of the mountain. It's not like you get on some of the glaciers on Rainier and you're like, this thing wants to kill me, I need to be really careful. So I think there's an element of it's just easy to be a bit more relaxed there because the danger is not nearly as in your face. And then you also look around, and maybe you see like 30 or 40 other people. And, this is an area where you're legally allowed to ride snowmobiles. So it's got a lot of different stuff going on. And there was even going to be a ski mountaineering race there last spring that was delayed due to weather, but hopefully it'll happen this spring. So just like lots of stuff goes on this glacier. And, anyway, it appeared that this fellow just skied down and stopped briefly and missed the fact that he was on a relatively shallow snow bridge, and it was just the right time of day where it was getting really weak. And he was even unlucky enough that his skis lined up parallel with the crevasse, and he punched through. And I think he got super lucky because his feet stayed under him, and he managed to come to a stop and was communicating with folks.
Upright.
Yeah, upright with folks on the
Mhm.
surface. So that just gave us a bit of got to take a nice breath, because obviously if somebody's down in there and they're unresponsive, that's a much worse situation. But anyway, I think at that point, Sam had skied up, and we started formulate a plan for getting this guy out. You want to take it from
And
there, Sam?
sure, I'll add too that where he went through, it was not entirely obvious there was a crevasse there. I mean, after he had poked through, obviously there was a hole in the snowpack, so you could see that there was a
Yeah.
crevasse there. But had he not gone through there, it was not at all obvious that there was a crevasse in that position. And it took us a little while when we were still above where he had gone through, just to kind of see where this crevasse might go and pick a safe place to ski down. Giving the hole a wide berth so we could loop back around to underneath where he had fallen through. So we showed up on the scene. He had probably fallen in, what do you think, Alan, maybe 10, 15 minutes prior to when we showed up on the scene. His partners did have some time to drop off their packs a little bit lower and were working their way back up to the crevasse, and they were in communication with him. And one of them had actually activated some kind of emergency beacon. I don't recall exactly what it was, but there was really poor cell reception in this area. So they said they had activated a beacon, but they weren't really able to have a two-way conversation with search and rescue folks. So it was a godsend to be able to actually chat with him to see, hey, how you doing? Like, what's going on down there? We were able to pretty quickly learn that the team did have a rope, but unfortunately it was in his backpack. So the
Which
one
was
rope
down in the
for
hole with
this
him.
team is down in the hole with him. He had been skiing, so he had ski boots on and skis, and his feet were underneath him. He wasn't sure if his skis had popped off or not. He felt like at least one, if not both of them, were still attached to his boots, had not released. And yeah, you could tell just in the tone of his voice that he, wasn't very excited to be down there, but he was doing okay. He wasn't like
Yeah.
screaming in pain or like really, really scared down there. He was, communicating up with us in a relatively calm manner. And then right around the time we were establishing about 20 feet below the lip of this crevasse, this other team of three guys who had been skiing down with us were also basically arriving on the scene, and it was really nice to have extra bit of gear from them. The guy who fell into the crevasse, his partners had a bit of gear, and these three guys had an extra rope, extra pulleys, extra carabiners, extra slings, and then Alan and I had a fair amount of gear too, because our original intent was to climb a moderately technical ice route on the north side. So we had a bit of extra gear than we would have typically taken on a glaciated ski trip. So first thing we did is just probed around where we were all stationed to make sure we weren't all standing on another crevasse 20 feet
Step
below
number
where he
one,
had fallen through.
is the
Yeah.
scene safe?
Yeah. And then pretty quickly got to work bearing a set of skis, a pair of skis as a dead man. And had a sling wrapped around that to serve as our master point. And then even with the strength and numbers that we had one of the guys in the other group just clip himself to that anchor and just kind of sit down in the snow a little bit below it. Just because it was getting later on in the day, we knew there'd probably be some weight on this anchor at one point or another. So we just wanted a little bit of backup there. And then Alan was gracious enough to volunteer to go down into the crevasse, and the crevasse looked pretty dark and scary. So I was more than happy to let him head down there. I didn't want to disappoint him.
It sort of seemed obvious to me that I was the logical choice to go down in. I just I don't have a ton of specific training in crevasse rescue as a professional arborist and a rope access technician and longtime mountain climber, wall climber. I just thought I probably had the most rigging expertise that I could bring to bear on the situation. And so yeah, I volunteered to go down in and then tried my best also to just get good communication with everyone on the site. And I feel like that is one of the things that we did do well is much as I haven't done a lot of training for crevasse rescue, I've done a lot of training for rescue and work situations. And just it's amazing how important that communication aspect is. And I think often overlooked. And we'll even do things like at work we'll use to simulate the stress of an actual rescue. A lot of times we'll use competition settings, and it's amazing the mistakes people will make when they go too fast, or the things that can get screwed up when people don't communicate well. So it's I've definitely tried to develop an approach of just slow down, communicate well, and you go a lot faster by not screwing things up than you do by trying. It's like the slowest smoothest fast approach. And I'd be really interested to know how I would have handled it if the situation had seemed a lot more dire with him, and just how I could have done controlling my own emotions in that situation. But it certainly helped that he sounded like things were fine down there. So there was really
Mhm.
no point in rushing. So we'd gotten that anchor built, and Sam had done a really nice job with that. I'd loaded up with a bunch of extra gear, and then even to really start approaching the edge, I'd gotten on a rope just with a prusik. So we had the rope we had with us was a pretty skinny, it's like a 7-1 or something, just a twin line cut down to 40 meters, and yeah, just real minimal stuff, which is sort of funny, but that's like our heavy rope, because normally we would have had just like a 30 meter, like 6 mil, something really small. But just sort of gave myself a little self belay, and was checking things out at the edge, probing for solid snow, and getting the um, one thing I don't often carry a shovel this late in the spring, just because we're sort of through the time of the year when we're carrying Avi gear, because everything's pretty much gone at that point. But one of the folks in the other team had a shovel. It was really nice because the snow, as I was trying to peel it away from the edge, was landing right on Ben's head. So,
Mhm.
and
Also to use it to dig the anchor,
yeah,
because
yeah,
yeah,
definitely faster than
your hands or your
or
boot.
yeah, or your ads
Yeah.
on our teeny tiny. So we just had Petzl gullies, so pretty minimal ice tools. So I think I'm one of the takeaways for me is I'm a little more sold on bringing, even if it's just like a jokey skimo shovel, like skimo race shovel that you would never actually trust in an avalanche situation. Just having something
Mhm.
um, is probably a pretty wise bet. But got the edge all dug back, and really had a good idea of where he was relative to where the edge was, and trying to figure out how best to get down in there. So that, yeah, those guys did a great job on the anchor, and we got ready by padding the lip. So we'd used a pair of skis quick strapped together for the dead man anchor, and then also a pair of skis quick strapped together for the edge padding, which seemed to be really nice because we just laid the lines between the tech binding, like toe and heels, and sort of held everything in place. What was that, Sam?
And I think initially, Alan, when you got to the lip and started digging out the lip, we weren't quite sure his status down there. Because theoretically, if he had landed on a snow bridge and had a harness on and had crampons and an axe, like we could have just dropped a loop down to him and just sort of hauled him out without actually sending somebody else down into the crevasse. So I think, Alan, we had given you a ton of gear, extra ice screws, extra slings, beaners, because we thought you could get to the lip and pad it and then drop a loop down from the other rope we had, and we might get lucky and be able to just haul him out, and this could all be over relatively quickly. That did not end up being the case, but we didn't quite know exactly what we would need to do until Alan, that is, was at the lip, had dug some snow out, was able to see him down towards the bottom of this crevasse, and had established some communication with him about where exactly he was and what was going on.
And I guess one of the critical pieces here is that he was wedged. So while he was uninjured, he was completely stuck. The crevasse was maybe towards its top was maybe 8 or 10 feet wide, and then constricted down to essentially nothing at the bottom, and had a pretty decent constriction right where he was. So while he was doing okay, he really could only move his arms like from the elbow up. And so there wasn't anything he could really do to help. And I think even if he'd been wearing a harness, I probably would have had to go down there just to clip the haul system onto his harness. I don't think he could have actually reached his waist. But as we'll get to in a minute, unfortunately, he wasn't wearing a harness, and that made the whole thing a bit more
Way
complex.
more challenging.
Yeah, yeah, um, yeah. So just that, yeah, good bringing that up, Sam, because that was a critical piece of everything that was going on. Just seeing what was going on with him, and where he was relative to what we had to do. But anyway, I switched over from just using a prusik on the rope to using an ATC backed up with a prusik. Normally, I wouldn't have the ATC, but again, we were doing some climbing. I would have just probably used a munter in my normal setup. But that was one thing I found interesting. This whole thing is it just the number of tools available for working on these really narrow diameter ropes. You just have sort of less and less things available as the diameter gets skinnier and skinnier. So it really pushes you to be able to work with the basics. And you can't just like, granted, it's we're running really light, so it's not like we'd have anything like a gree or something that could really go up and down easily with us anyways. But just seems like one of the things, in my reflections on all of this, I think a lot of folks that are carrying these really light ropes, I don't think many of them have actually like tried using them for any of this
Right.
stuff.
Practice with your gear and use
Yeah,
your equipment. Know
because
how it works in all the scenarios.
it's one thing to just haul on so it'll feature in this story. There's the micro traction, which is this little Petzl pulley that has a toothed cam in it. Works great on all these really narrow things, and like that's just super easy and straightforward. Like building an anchor, hauling on a micro traction, that's all really easy. But like actually ascending and descending these ropes, I think that's where it gets a lot more challenging, and that's the sort of stuff where even if you're like a comfortable, competent rock climber, you might find it to be a bit tricky. But anyway, so I dropped down in and got down to Ben, and it was a really tricky situation. So, I mean, for one, you're down there in the hole, and while it's like 55 and slightly cloudy up above, it's just dripping wet down in there. And he was already starting to get pretty cold, and understandably so, because he's sandwiched between two blocks of ice. Even
Yep.
though he was wearing a hard shell, so it's not like he was underdressed for the day, but it there's just no way you're not going to get cold. And this is another thing that I sort of, if you'd asked me this, I would have told you, well, obviously a crevasse is going to be kind of wet and cold, but it's like real wet and real cold down there. And I didn't even dress appropriately and ended up getting kind of cold towards the end. But he's just wedged in there, one arm above his head, one arm in front of him, and he's just barely able to move around and not really able to help with much anything. And then one of his toes is still engaged in his skis, and they're jammed way below him. So that's tricky. And then even if he wasn't still in one of his skis, it's all just ice around him, and he's in ski boots. So essentially can't do anything there. So I think first thing I did was built an anchor and got some of my stuff off. As Sam said, we just loaded me up with all sorts of stuff. I even took a backpack down, warm clothes and just other random stuff that I thought I might need. And that whole time I'm still working off just the ATC and a Prusik, and just sort of, I ended up having to do a good deal of up and down. So I would just pull rope through the ATC and then tighten up the Prusik. And also that whole time, which is the thing that ended up being really nice, is I had steel-toed crampons and I had my Petzl gullies, which actually can swing into ice, unlike a lot of the super light Skimo aluminum stuff that a lot of people are using, and I use sometimes. So it was nice to have some gear that it's still pretty light stuff, but not like the lightest. So I just ended up, I built an anchor, and then we started to figure out how we're going to get him unwedged. And luckily there was a little shelf, probably like 3-4 feet up from where his feet were, like vertically, maybe 4 feet up, and then probably 4 or 5 feet back. I was able to I could have stood there unroped. It was just a nice flat shelf. Like he could, as long as we could get him to the shelf, he could stand there, and we could get a harness on him and get that all figured out. But like getting him there was going to be real tricky. And I ended up, we tried a few different.
Was there a possibility of him falling farther down in the crevasse? Like if he
He
moved a certain way, could he have gone any deeper?
So a couple interesting things there. One is that he could have like maybe gotten a little further in there. We were pretty darn near the bottom. It was like a big long crack that he and all his stuff had fallen into, and then right behind him where I was sort of set up, that crack went maybe like 5 or 6 feet deeper, but it's still sort of constricted with like it. Maybe if you were really unlucky, you could have gotten yourself wedged in a decent bit deeper, but not like, we're not like staring off into the abyss here. Like we're pretty much
Okay.
at the bottom of this thing. But the scary part is like at one point he did slip down a little, and he's like, it's getting hard to breathe, which was really the only truly oh shit moment of the whole operation. But just that idea that folks can slip in and get so wedged that they are starting to have trouble breathing. That just thinking through the ways in which you can be down there and just really be in trouble, either because you're having trouble breathing or because you're cold, or I think we think about trauma a lot with crevasse falls, which is a very legitimate thing to be worried about. But the dangers go far beyond that, which certainly it was sort of driven home watching him get rapidly much more hypothermic. Um, but then, I mean, probably good to go back to you at this point, Sam, because you're managing things up on the surface.
Yeah, so I was anchored into the rope as well, that Alan was basically hanging from. I just had a prusik out that I was able to slide back and forth. And as soon as Alan started wrapping down into the crevasse, we got to work up on the glacier, just trying to anticipate what Ben might need when we got him out. So we had the rest of the folks going through the gear that they had to find, warm, dry jacket, warm, dry hat, warm, dry shirt, long underwear, socks. We had a small little jet boil stove, so we had someone melting some snow for hot water, and I think someone also had a freeze dry meal that they were going to prepare and have that be nice and hot when he came up.
This is like the
Um,
most amazing crew to arrive on scene
Well,
ever.
we
You
were
know what I
really
mean?
lucky to have that many people there. I
Yeah,
mean, this will be
right.
one of the lessons at the end. But if you're just a team of two and somebody goes in, especially if that person's carrying the rope, like your resources all of a sudden become very, very limited. So we were really, really lucky to have this other crew of guys be there, and for everyone to be relatively well equipped. So by the time we pooled our group resources, we had a lot going for us. Um, and we also figured once we knew that he didn't have a harness on, we knew we'd have to get him into a harness. We knew, we'll talk about this a little bit later perhaps, but he was wearing ski boots that weren't going to work with the crampons that he had. He had mountain boots that were going to work with his crampons, but those were in his pack. So we figured we'd need to haul him out of this, short of having him change boots down there, which didn't seem like a very good idea. So we had one of the other group members on the surface of the glacier start probing in a straight line away from the crevasse in the direction we would be hauling, to make sure that whoever's at the back of the rope, hauling him out, wouldn't like step into a crevasse downhill from where we were working. And they actually found one like not too far back from where everyone had dropped all their gear, maybe 15, 20 feet further down the mountain. So we put a big X with ski poles at the lip of that, so no one would go beyond that point. So we figured we'd have to reset a few times on the haul, but we'd keep it pretty tight. Wouldn't have people heading down slope too far and potentially falling into this other crevasse. And then, yeah, other than that stuff going on, I was kind of just at the lip, talking with Alan, relaying information about what was going on up at the surface. He was sending info about what he had going on down there. But our first goal was really just getting him unwed so that we could get a harness on him. And that proved to be pretty challenging. I know, Alan, you tried at least a few different things before we settled on a technique that worked for that.
Yeah. And I'll just say, like, from what Sam was saying there, that role of being the communicator on the edge was really critical. It
It sounds
made,
crucial.
yeah, it made, for one, it just made me and Ben feel a lot better just having this link to the surface. Sam would go to do something totally legitimate for like a minute or two, and I'd be like,
Like, "No,
"Where?
go back.
Yeah,
Wait."
help! Anybody! I'm stuck in a crevasse." Um, just having somebody up there, and even if he wasn't doing anything, just being able to like look up and see him up there was very reassuring. So I think anyone who's doing a crevasse rescue, just like keep that in mind, of having that friendly face up there to relay information or just be there for you is really key. But we tried a few different things. Like I tried snaking. Now, granted, these are Dyneema slings, so they're real skinny. I tried snaking a sling between his legs and sort of combining that with a sling on his backpack, and that was too uncomfortable. So we had the team on the surface trying to do a bit of hauling on stuff that I was just setting up on Ben's gear, and so we're hauling it, and this is the haul system we ended up using throughout the whole rescue, but it's just called a drop loop, where you essentially have one end of the rope tied off to the anchor, and then you send a loop of rope down into the crevasse, goes through a pulley, and in this case is a progress capture pulley, So that's what's doing all the, sort of life protection that'll ensure that the person doesn't drop. But then that tail of the rope goes back up and out of the crevasse over the edge and then gets pulled on from there. So the nice thing is it's a 2-to-1. And also there's very little slop or sit back, because that cam is just really good at capturing pretty much all the progress that you make. And also, granted, on ropes this skinny, you really can't. Prussics aren't that reliable. We were sort of using them because we had to, but we certainly wouldn't have wanted to haul on them. So anyway, the thing that finally ended up working is I just got like 2 different slings tied off to a bunch of different places on his backpack. Backpacks are strong, luckily, and we ended up doing that, getting him unwedged there, and then it was even tricky just to get him back a few feet. I think I had to hang some slings off the anchor to get his boots in, and finally, just with much like heaving and hoeing, we got him stood onto this ledge where he could just take a moment. And he was getting real cold by that point. I mean, it was good because now that he wasn't sandwiched between ice cubes, things were he was still pretty wet, so I don't think he was getting better yet, but he wasn't getting worse. But even
he was so relieved.
yeah, he was pretty psyched. But even things like, I had to like put his harness on him, right? Because his hands had lost the dexterity to do that, which I mean, I've experienced that many times. So I totally get what was happening there. But just really, really good victory for morale and for just him feeling like things were moving along too, and for us feeling like we were making good progress, getting him stood on that ledge. And that was pretty simple. Just got him in a harness. One of the interesting things, I took a spare harness with me, but it didn't fit, so I had to go digging in his pack for his, which is definitely a thing, because I think, I mean, let's be honest, there's sort of like a lot of people that climb mountains are sort of the same size, and there's not maybe as many people that are from very different sizes. I don't know, I'm trying to put that in the most gentle way possible. But we just, I have one harness that's not adjustable, and it only fits people of a certain size. So it's sort of this interesting thing to think about. You get into a situation, you're trying to help somebody else out. So get them in a harness, and then on the surface they started hauling, and it went super smooth up to a point. So I'll let you take it back, Sam.
Well, Alan, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you had to kind of dive underneath him to get his ski off before we could get him up onto that ledge.
Yeah.
So I think we were trying to haul on his backpack, but we were running into some resistance from the one ski that was still attached to his boot. So it took a fair amount of time.
Stuck in the
I
crack.
think
So when
Alan had to kind of
try and
like
pull him up, like his leg was pulling him down.
Yeah, so I think you had to kind of dive in head first down there to try to get his boot out, Alan. And so the process of getting him unwedged and just moved, 5 feet onto this little ledge took easily an hour, if not more. That was probably the
Wow.
most challenging part of all this. By the time we got him in a harness and we were starting to haul him up, that part went actually pretty smoothly and pretty quickly. But speaking of which, we got him in his harness. We had this drop loop on his harness now, and we had plenty of people up on the surface of the glacier to haul. So we didn't feel like we needed more of a mechanical advantage than the 2-to-1 that the drop loop gave us. And we all had either a knot on the rope to hold on to. Some people had little T-blocks, other people had prussics, so something where you could put your weight into the rope. It's kind of difficult, just holding on to these tiny little ropes with your hands and pulling. But we had 5 people able to pull on the rope. So we made relatively quick progress. Again, he didn't have crampons on, so he just has slippery plastic boots on glacier ice. So he wasn't really able to do much other than just kind of, use his feet and his hands to just sort of, so he wasn't scraping up the ice, just to kind of guide his body as we were hauling him up. We had to reset a few times, but the nice thing about that micro traction is that it just grabs that progress you've made. There's no drop back down. And then we got him to the lip, and having perused Freedom of the Hills back in the day, you're like, oh, getting people over the lip can be kind of challenging. So I thought we were all ready for this. I had an ice axe planted.
It's
oh
so
my
hard.
gosh.
It's the hardest part of it. It's the hardest part of it.
Well, and in his defense, he's freezing cold. At one point on the haul, I think one of his gloves had gotten caught in the micro traction, so we had to somehow lower him a little bit to get his glove unstuck because we weren't able to haul him anymore. So this guy had been through so much up to this point. I thought just burying an axe over the lip, you'd be able to grab onto the axe and kind of, you know, duck and roll
Pull
yourself
yourself
up under
over.
the surface of the crevasse
No,
under the
not when
glacier.
you're
Like
that cold and that
how
tired.
how tricky could that be? But when you're wearing like slippery plastic ski boots, you're freezing cold, you can't really feel your hands, you're exhausted, you just want to be out of this thing. It took a lot of work. We ended up I kind of hung myself over the lip of the crevasse and just sunk an ice screw in as far down as I could reach, then hung a shoulder length runner from that, a shoulder length sling from that. So he was able to get one of his feet in that sling and then use that as a foot. And he was able to kind of pull himself up and get to the point where his belay loop on his harness was pretty much even with the lip of the crevasse, just a little below. And then I thought for sure we get it, but with his boots so slippery and him just not having much upper body strength, as you're trying to haul, you're kind of just pulling him into the lip instead of pulling him up and over the lip. So we basically got him up a few inches, and then I took that screw out and put it in about 2 feet higher. I hung the sling from it again. He was able to get his foot into that, and then with 2 axes, one for each of his hands, over the lip and standing up in this sling, he was able to get his center of gravity up over the lip of the crevasse and then kind of roll onto the top of the glacier. So that part was time consuming as well, and the poor guy was, I think, done for the day at this point. But in reasonably good spirits all through that. So
What were the other spirits like? What was the tone and the energy like of everybody that was up on the top hauling? Were people frantic, calm, scared? Like what were people feeling?
these guys were doing great. The team of 3 guys who were skiing down with us, who weren't in the same party as Ben, had gear. They were prepared as far as the gear goes. They were great friends with each other. They were chatting with Ben's 2 partners the whole time, getting to know them a little bit better, getting to know Ben a bit better. Intermittently, someone would try to get a call out with a cell phone. We tried everyone's cell phones. Somebody's, actually may have been mine. We were able to sort of get a call out, but then it dropped pretty quickly after we were connected with search and rescue. So yeah, just kind of getting ready for getting him out, getting as much prepared as possible. But everyone was calm, probably a bit nervous, probably a bit scared, but they were keeping their composure pretty well, I think.
Well, so Ben's out of the crevasse, but you got Alan still in there. Alan, how did you get out? Did you climb out?
We all just took off
I
at that point. We figured Alan could fend for himself.
Bye,
So,
Alan.
yeah.
well, I wanted to collect his gear because it seemed like at that point he was going to be in good enough shape to get himself out of there, and I figured it'd be a lot easier if he got himself out of there on his skis than. And they're a nice pair of skis too, and I didn't want to leave a bunch of garbage in the crevasse, so we fished around and I had Sam haul out his pack and then sent up another load. Sam was just at the lip, just hand over handing stuff out for a little while and sent out his skis. I think we only ended up losing a few little inconsequential items to the mountain. At least that's what I think happened. And then that's the point at which I started to really get cold. I had ignored Sam's perfectly good advice of wearing a hard shell down into there, and I had been nice and warm when I was basically just climbing up and over him multiple times and chimneying around. It was really kind of fun climbing in a lot of ways, except for there's a person right near your crampons and you need to not stab them.
Hit
So
him.
that
Yeah.
that part was a little taxing.
He probably appreciated that.
Yeah, no puncture wounds that I know of. At least if one happened, he was very stoic. So I had, but in just the 15 minutes that it took to get him out, I was just standing there. It's the only reason I have a few pictures. I didn't intend to take photos, but my camera just lives on my backpack, and my backpack went down there with me. And then he was getting hauled out, and I didn't have anything else to do, so I actually got one of the better photos I feel like I've taken of him getting hauled out. But then, yeah, just collected gear, and then I actually found it pretty easy to climb out, just sort of chimneying up for part of it. And then I'd given him one tool to try to help out climbing a little bit with, and I just had a single tool and actually just sort of zipped right out of there. But with only the confidence that you can have when you're on top rope, I'm sure if I was trying to free solo my way out of there, it would have been
Be
very,
different.
very different story. But it then popped up to the surface, and definitely noticed how chilly I was, and was happy that everybody was up there, and everything seemed to be going on pretty well. which is like a sort of also funny coda to the story, because I got back to the surface and I had decent reception. So I started getting texts because it was late on a Sunday. My partner didn't know where I was, and I run the tracker on my inReach, which had just randomly stopped tracking in the middle of a glacier for, what. We still never. I should have looked back at my watch to see how long I was in there for, but yeah, I mean, Sam, what do you figure, is that like 2.5 hours, something like that?
Probably, yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely over an hour and a half, probably over two.
Yeah, and so I emerged to these like "Are you okay?" texts, and that was it was both like I needed to get back to them ASAP to have them not worry, but also it was a perfect like proof of concept that if it had been me, um, somebody would have at least known relatively soon. I mean, granted, I was skiing with Sam that day, but I've done some soloing on glaciers, and but it definitely a real wake up, because while he ended up being on the glacier and being okay, and like totally coming back around with some movement and some fluids and some dry clothes, I'm pretty convinced that if he had been sandwiched in that ice for even another 20 minutes or half hour, like it would have been reaching critical, really critical situation with the hypothermia. And I don't know how he would have fared if they had to wait on a search and rescue to arrive, which I'm sure there would have been at least a couple hours behind us in the best case scenario. And then, it's not hard to imagine. Like it's pretty wild to think, right? You could just have this sort
Oh, no,
of,
that's a sobering thought.
yeah, like you have this semi miraculous fall where you go 35 feet and don't get hurt, and then you could still be fighting for your life, or potentially not make it just from pure hypothermia. So that thing, and then just
Yeah.
feeling how chilly I've gotten, and I've played this game a bunch of like how little stuff can I bring, as a sort of early and very enthusiastic adopter of the ultra lightweight side of things. But I think in recent years, the pendulum has swung back towards just
Well, now you're
bring
starting to
some
carry your
more
shovel
stuff.
with you.
Yeah, I know. Think of the vertical feat that will not be climbed because of this silly shovel. Um,
Training weight.
yeah, yeah. So it was definitely a lot to think about there, because I
Yeah.
thinking back on some of my, and that was something, I just, one thing I want to leave folks with is that, well, obviously we like showed up and hauled a guy out, and that makes us look pretty good. Like this could have very easily been me, and I've done some really silly stuff in the mountains, and luck was on my side, and I got away with it, and hopefully I've learned from it. But come ask me in 50 years if I really did, if I'm still here, and we'll know the answer at that point. So anyway, I have tons of respect, especially for folks that come on here and tell their story, and especially if it's maybe a story that involves some questionable decision making. That takes a ton of courage to do that.
Mhm.
And I just want to recognize, like, I've been a very lucky person. But even just a couple of weeks after this happened, I dumped my dirt bike, broke my leg, and I was really
Oh, no.
impressed. I was really impressed with how quickly it was, like 60 degrees out. I was plenty warm, wearing all these pads, and shock made me really cold really fast. And all I could think is, I'm so glad I'm not on snow right now. So just that whole, it's a big deal. Hypothermia, shock, warming. It can become a really big deal really fast. And I don't think a lot of folks realize how big a deal it can become, how quickly. Um, but yeah. And then I guess my last just sort of thing that I'm really struggling with, is how best to approach the rope situation. Because so we have this situation where the person with the rope fell in, but that could vary. So that same day, Sam and I were out there, and one of us had the rope. I don't even remember who it was, but it's the classic: you carry the stove, I carry the rope. And we typically only rope up if we are on foot ascending on our crampons. Pretty much never rope up skinning, and almost never rope up skiing. So there's, in a two-person team, there's a 50% chance the person that went in the crevasse had the rope. And so that's what personally I'm struggling with, because, Sam and I talked about this a little bit, and it's like, yeah, maybe he could have soloed down in there. I mean, he's a pretty good climber, better than I am. So I don't know, but Yeah, I'd love to know your thoughts on this too, Sam. Of just like, are we going to start throwing in a second rope, like when we do stuff like this?
Yeah, it's a really interesting thought. You want to go light and fast, and the idea of carrying a whole second rope seems, completely against that whole ethic. But yeah, if you have one rope and you're not roped up, which we rarely ever do when skiing downhill. The one time we've ever done that was during a race when it was mandatory, and that was awful. So we never ski downhill roped up. And if somebody, the guy or gal carrying the rope goes in, I don't know a good solution other than having a second rope, or hoping that you're on a busy route and there's going to be other people around, or relying on the person's ability who's down in the crevasse to self rescue. Whether that's climb out themselves, which their crampons are in their pack, their axes are probably on the back of their pack, their feet are on skis. You have a
Yeah, or
harness.
if he's your
Hopefully,
wedge, I mean, just like Ben.
your
Ben was
wedge.
wedged. There's
Yeah,
no way that
yeah.
Ben could have
He could have.
could have taken part in his rescue at that
Yeah,
point.
he could have had crampons on his feet. He could have had an axe in one hand. He could have had a harness on with a bunch of screws and gear on it, and have been just as stuck as he was without any of those things.
Right.
So yeah, I perhaps very naively, I'm always like, well, if I carry two ice screws, I can just leapfrog them up the crevasse and aid my way out. But I'm not sure exactly how well that would work if I was faced with that task. So yeah, I mean, like, whenever you head into the mountains, you take risks, you take calculated risks. At least we think they're calculated, and this is definitely one of them. Carrying just one rope, when you're a team of two or three, in this case.
That's a good point. Sam, what are some of the lessons that you learned from this incident?
Well, I think when, and we were talking about this a bit earlier, when you're heading down this route on the south side of Baker, it's a gorgeous day. It's mid-afternoon. There's 40 or 50 other people who have skied it just before you. You can see the tree line down below you. It's a very gradual snow slope in terms of like big mountain skiing. It's really easy just to let your guard down and just be like, I am having fun with my friends today. Like we're down off the summit. We're 1,000 feet or two down. Like the weather's nice. Like this is going to go great. I can just, do some pleasure skiing now. And this is where this guy got into big trouble in that kind of terrain. So it goes back to, I think, just recognizing that there's basically always something that can go wrong. Even in your car driving home at the end of the day in the mountains, you could get in a car accident if you fall asleep at the wheel, or miss a red light or something. So it just, constant vigilance is so important, and it's so easy to just let your guard down and have fun out there, which is what we're all doing when we go into the mountains, hopefully. And just keeping a few neurons in your brain that are assessing the risk around you always firing, and just thinking about all the little things you could potentially do to be mitigating that risk, which again, in this scenario, where he fell in, it was absolutely not obvious there was a crevasse there. I think anyone could have come to a stop there and have fallen into that crevasse. But just trying to do your best with always having your danger feelers out, and always be doing little things here and there to try to mitigate risk.
The big blaring one is wear your helmet, wear your harness. I think it's just so simple, and something that we've been adhering to for a while now. It's just, if glacier, then harness.
Yeah,
it would
have a
it
couple
would have
screws on your
dramatic
harness, have some
yeah,
gear, have a helmet. Yeah.
it would have dramatically eased this rescue. I would have been down there for way less time, and he would have been out of there much sooner, if I could have just gone down, clipped onto a harness. And if he had been unresponsive, I mean, that's probably the last little thought here, is just, if folks haven't ever like tried to deal with an unresponsive person, which I haven't had to deal with an unresponsive human being, but I've trained with rescue dummies, which are obviously not easy to come by, but in the rope access world and professional world, we get to use them here and there. So it's a whole different ball game, because even
Oh
training
yeah, I can
on your
imagine.
friend and them trying to pretend to be unresponsive, you just subconsciously, you end up helping, for one, and for two, it's so uncomfortable to try to be truly unresponsive, especially if you're hanging in a harness. You basically can't do it. You can only do it for very brief periods. So it's, yeah, that, thinking about the challenge of getting him over the lip, he was helping, and so I think I always knew this stuff was challenging, and I've trained it a bunch in other settings, but yeah, dealing with an unresponsive victim in this situation would have just been a whole nother layer. And I think that folks that maybe have never had that opportunity to try to move a dummy around and perform a roped rescue, it's I don't know where anyone actually gets access to that if they're just like approaching this from a recreational side of things. But it's yeah, we're heavy and awkward, and
Mhm.
if we're not helping, we're a real pain in the butt to move around.
Well, hopefully we don't have to hopefully I don't have to do that. Hopefully you guys don't have to do that again.
Yeah.
And if, if there's any listeners on the that are listening to this show right now, you know, hopefully with your guys' experience, they've learned something and they'll show up more prepared, and they'll be wearing their harness on a glacier and wearing their helmet on the glacier and all those things that you guys taught them, and hopefully you'll minimize some future outdoor accidents.
That's the hope, and hopefully it's
Yeah.
not one of us getting hauled out here in the
But
future,
it could,
but it could be.
it could be, and that's the whole point of the
Mm.
show. Is like you were saying earlier, Alan. Like nobody is invincible.
Yeah.
No, doesn't matter how much of an expert you are or you are not. Accidents happen. I mean, you said earlier that um, Ben was not. It wasn't like he wasn't where he should not have been. He was cruising around that had been skied all day, and snow machines go up on that route, and she just happened to be really unlucky in a really bad spot, the really bad time. So it can happen to anybody, and that's so important for us to remember. And I really appreciate that you guys aren't judging him, and you guys are just like, hey, this happened, and we want to share our experience, and here's some lessons that we learned. That's just thank you so much.
No problem. Thanks so much for having
Oh,
us, and I've really enjoyed listening, and I've learned a lot from a lot of folks who've shared their stories on here.
yeah, I'd echo that, Ashley. Thank you so much for having us. And then just to finish the story, where we left it, he was still on the glacier, so we probably should
Oh yeah.
we probably
Oh,
should mention
right.
that we did get down okay. Everybody did that day. He started off. Well, I did a quick assessment of him once we had dry clothes on him, got him some warm food, got him some warm water to drink. He felt okay to walk out. So we had a little bit of reception at that point on one of the phones, and we were able to call off the rescue once Alan got out of the crevasse, and he was confident that he could walk down. Ben was confident he could walk down. We were able to just call off the search and rescue resources that were on their way. And he
That's good.
started off walking. He made it maybe 50, 60 feet, and then we felt like it was probably safer for him to be on skis, just with the extra flotation that affords. So we got him back onto some skis, and then he and Alan had skied down to below the glacier, and his two partners wanted to walk; they didn't want to ski or snowboard down to the edge of the glacier. So I just kind of did some skiing with them, sort of following the boot pack down, basically just taking a straight shot to where Alan and Ben were. And the three guys, around the time that we were packing up from the rescue, they had taken off. They were kind of hot to get back, and we didn't feel like we needed any extra people at that point. So they had taken off at that point. And then we got off the glacier down onto just a seasonal snowfield lower down on the mountain. And the three of them were pretty confident in their ability to get back to the car at that point. There was a pretty obvious boot pack that took you back to the trail and back to the trailhead. So Helen and I took off at that stage, hightailed it back home because it was getting kind of late in the day. I think the way it was, we
Back
didn't
to
get back
partners.
until pretty late in the evening. It wasn't quite
There
early
was
morning yet, but it was definitely late evening by the time we got home.
there was a little element of like looking at our watch, being like, "You guys are all good, right?"
So, have you heard from Ben since
um,
then? Have you?
I think I texted with him a little bit afterwards, and like everything was fine. It sounded
Yeah,
like, but
yeah,
I
probably
actually
pretty
encouraged
catch up.
him too to like. I was like, hey, just make sure you like put some time into like process this, because this sort of
Yeah,
traumatic experience can really mess with you if you don't actually like, if you're not intentional about trying to deal with it. Having had some similar stuff like that happen, it can, yeah, it can really get in there and get to you. And I'm sure he'll never look at a glacier the same way again, having experienced that.